Hi, and welcome to Baroque Music, musical features, developments and composers. So Baroque music was during the 17th century that the system of modes finally crumbled away. By adding accidentals, which is the black and white keys on the piano, the major and minor key system developed. The 17th century also saw the invention of several new forms and designs, such as the opera, the sonata, oratorio, suite, the fugue, and the concerto. The Baroque orchestra. The orchestra started to take shape, mainly in the string section, and the violins became the dominant instrument and the most important in orchestras, and generally still is today. So the most famous composers of the period, the ones that you would mainly know would be Vivaldi, Corelli, Monteverdi, Bach, Handel, and Purcell. The other ones are certainly very famous, but they're the ones that you would be more familiar with. Monody. This is an unusual term, but a monody is a single voice line supported by an instrumental bass line upon which chords were constructed. The voice line followed the natural speech rhythms of the words. This style of writing for the voice, which is half singing and half reciting, became known as a recitative. A recitative in a Baroque terms is almost like an introduction. They sort of half speak what they're actually going to introduce before they start singing the whole song. All the composer wrote down beneath the melody was the bass line to be played by a low-stringed instrument such as a cello. This was called a basso continuo, but the composer expected another continuo player on the harpsichord, organ or lute to build up chords upon the bass line. As these chords had to be improvised, the player had to be very skillful. Figures below the notes indicated which chords to play, and this was then later known as what was called the figured bass. So the basso continuo itself, in Baroque music, a special subgroup of an instrumental ensemble, which was the basso continuo. It consists of two instruments reading the same part, a bass instrument, such as a cello or a bassoon, and a chordal instrument, which was most often a harpsichord, but sometimes was an organ or a lute. Its appearance in the early 17th century reflected the radically new musical texture of accompanied melody that was especially typical of the new vocal genre of opera. The continuo, which has a counterpart in the bass and rhythm guitar of a rock band, came to be employed in virtually all ensemble music of the Baroque era. And here's an example of a basso continuo. Have a listen for the bass line. Early opera. The first opera was written in 1597 and it was called Daphne and was composed by Peri. It had choruses, dances and instrumental pieces, all done by a small orchestra. It contained music and drama, that is, music drama. The first truly great opera was composed by Monteverdi in 1607 and was called Orfeo. The music heightens the dramatic impact. The music and the drama blend well together. And there was lots of instrumental ritornello, which is Italian for return and means when a section returns. Before each verse of the aria, which is the song, we hear an instrumental ritornello. So the Baroque aria. A da capo aria is in ternary form, meaning it is composed of three sections. The first section is a complete musical entity ending in the tonic key, which is the key that it's actually written in, and could in principle be sung alone. The second section contrasts with the first in its musical key, texture, mood, and sometimes also tempo. The third section was usually not written out by the composer, who rather simply specified the direction da capo, which is Italian from the head, meaning from the beginning, which meant that the first section should be repeated in full. If you've ever heard of the term da capo al fine, it means you go play the beginning, middle section, and then you go back to the beginning and play till you see the word fine, which means ending. The text for da capo aria was typically a poem or other verse sequence written in two strophes, which is the first section for A, hence which was repeated later, and the second for B. Each strophe consisted from 3 to 6 lines and terminated in a line containing a masculine ending. In other words, a very fancy, strong ending. The Italian Overture. Scarlatti's operas often began with an overture in 3 sections: quick, slow, quick. This was the Italian Overture. Scarlatti designed the arias in his operas in da capo form, that is, ABA. Another name for this is ternary form, and here's an example of a Scarlatti piece of music. The French overture, on the other hand, was opposite to the Italian. Lully's operas began with the French overture, which in other words went slow, quick, slow, which is the opposite to the Italian overture, which went quick, slow, quick. The Baroque opera in England, though. One of the most famous operas for English composers was by Purcell, and it was the opera called Dido and Aeneas. And if you're really interested in that one, Google it and go and have a look on YouTube. You'll find plenty of clips, and it's a very beautiful, dramatic opera. The oratorio was another development in the Baroque era. It was born about the same time as opera. This vocal music was at first very similar to operas. They had arias, choruses, and recitatives. A recitative, remember, is like an introduction to a song. They were acted out with scenery and costumes. The main difference was that an oratorio was based on a sacred story, in other words, a religious story or a Bible story. Eventually, oratorios ceased to be acted out and were given musical presentation only. Handel's Messiah, Samson, Israel, and Egypt are all oratorios. And here's a very famous chorus from Handel's Messiah, Hallelujah. A Passion was a special oratorio which was telling the story of Christ's crucifixion. Besides the recitatives, arias, and choruses, Bach also included settings of chorals, which are German hymn tunes. And again, the Passion of the Christ, it was all about the crucifixion. So they were like an oratorio, but unlike the oratorios, they were specifically centered around Christ and his crucifixion. And there was generally, depending on the composer, they were written and commissioned by a church because they wanted all these people to turn up and come to the actual mass, and this is one way that they did it. They would spend a whole year preparing for these types of events. The cantata. Bach also composed more than 200 church cantatas. Cantata means sung, sonata means played. These are for soloists and choruses, accompanied by orchestra and continuo, again, which is your bass line, and are like miniature oratorios. A fine example is number 140 by Bach, based upon the choral Sleeper's Wake. And here's an example, not of that particular one, but you'll get the idea. That was the one called Jesu Joy. Instrumental music. During the Baroque period, instrumental music became equally as important as vocal music, unlike in the Renaissance where the vocal music was more important. The fugue was one of the biggest developments in the era, and Bach was more famous for these than anything else. I'll play this while I'm talking and you'll get the idea of what a fugue is all about. So a fugue is a contrapuntal piece based upon the idea of imitation. It is usually written for 3 or 4 parts called voices, and these are referred to as soprano, alto, tenor and bass. The detailed structure of a fugue can be rather complicated. The entire piece grows mainly from a single brief tune of a strong musical character, which you've just heard then. This is called the subject. Then it is repeated by other voices in turn, each at its appropriate pitch. The most famous is the collection of 48 preludes and fugues by Bach. The suite. A suite is a collection of dances for one or more instruments. Many were written for harpsichord. They contain a German allemande, which is in 4/4 time at a moderate speed, a French courante in 3/2 time at a moderately fast speed. The Italian version is the corrente, and a Spanish sarabande in a slow triple time, and a jig usually in compound time, in other words a 6/8, and this is an example of a Spanish sarabande. However, before or after a jig, a composer might introduce dances such as the minuet, which is in 3 time, a slow and stately waltz, or a borde, a gavotte, or a passipede. Sometimes a suite began with a prelude, which is an opening piece. The pieces were usually in the same key and in binary form, which is A-B. French composers, however, often wrote in rondo form, which is A-B, A-C, D-A, etc. It just kept on returning to the main theme of A. Baroque sonatas. A sonata means sounded, which is to be played. Many Baroque sonatas were for 2 violins and continuo, which is usually the cello and harpsichord, and I'll play this one for you at the moment, which is a Bach one. Composers called these trio sonatas. There are only 3 music lines. The harpsichord plays the figured bass. A violin sometimes was also replaced with a flute or an oboe. Baroque sonatas, there were 2 main types. The sonata da camera, which is a chamber sonata. Camera is Italian for chamber. These are meant to be played in people's homes. The continuo would be played by the harpsichord or lute. Or the sonata da chiesa, which is church sonata. Chiesa is Italian for church. These were played in churches, obviously. The continuo is played by the organ in that case. These were far more serious than the chamber sonatas. Purcell, Corelli, Bach, Handel, Scarlatti and Couperin all composed sonatas. The Concerto Grosso. I'll play this one again while I'm talking. The word concerto means get together. The idea of opposition and contrast led to 2 contrasting groups of instruments. A small group of soloists, which was usually 2 violins and a cello, called the concertino, and an orchestra of strings called either the ripieno or the tutti, meaning everyone. The solo concerto, though, again I'll play this example. Very famous one. This grew out of the concerto grosso and has a single instrumental solo and a string orchestra. There are solo sections and tutti sections. The quick movements were often ritornello form, tutti 1, solo 1, tutti 2, solo 2, tutti 3, etc. This is Vivaldi's Autumn. Vivaldi wrote more than 500 concertos, both concerto grossos and solo concertos, his most famous being the Four Seasons, which this is one of. The orchestra. During the Baroque period, the orchestra started to take shape. The string section became a self-contained unit. To this, composers would add other instruments in ones and twos, flutes, recorders, oboes, bassoons, horns, and occasionally trumpets and kettle drums. There was still a continuo, which is your bass line. There was a lot of contrast, especially in the dynamics. Sometimes there were also echo effects. And the main thing you need to remember for dynamics is that they were block dynamics or terrace dynamics. So there weren't any crescendos and decrescendos. They were mainly loud or soft, not much in between. And that's what a Baroque orchestra looks like. There's not as many instruments as there is in a modern day orchestra. So the main features of Baroque music are the basso continuo, which is the figured bass, one mood throughout the entire piece, important string sections, modes were replaced by the major or minor key system, many different forms are used, in other words binary, fugue, rondo, all those sorts of things, da capo al fine, many types of music, in other words the choral, the opera, the dance suite, and energetic rhythms which were exuberant, long melodies, lots of ornamentation, contrasts, and especially those things were in the dynamics, but also in tone colours. And that's the end.